Hello and welcome to this special midnight edition of the Politics Joe podcast. How
Hello,
are you, Laura?
I'm good, thank you.
We're going to talk to you about what's in the long-awaited employment rights bill that will be laid before Parliament today. It's the Make Work Pay agenda, the renamed New Deal for workers that unions have been clamouring for quite some time. Laura, what's in it?
Well, an end to 0 hours contracts is one of the 28 individual employment reforms. Currently, there's 1.3 million people in the UK on 0 hours contracts. And Labour are saying that they will introduce a right to guaranteed working hours if people want them. What do you make of that?
It's interesting, isn't it? Because I think that the way that this was first billed, which frightened employers, was there's going to be no 0 hours contracts. And actually, some people do like being on them. The problem is if you are on a long-term semi-employment with somewhere and you've had basically guaranteed hours, but you've got no rights because you're still on the 0 hour contract. So this would, if you have been on it for a significant amount of time and you've worked a significant amount of hours, you would be entitled to go onto a contract.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting as well because there's also almost 500,000 people in the gig economy, and I felt like just reading the whole release, it felt like that was maybe something that was missed, because if you look at who's forming kind of the precariat and an insecure employment, it is people on 0 hours contracts, but it's also people within the gig economy. And more than half of gig economy workers in the UK are currently earning less than minimum wage. And that feels like something that was maybe not addressed in the employment rights bills. It's
interesting because I think that a lot of the time when we talk about 0 hours contracts, it's spoken about by people who've never worked one. So, there's always this argument that, there are mothers who want to be on these because it's more convenient with family life, or there are students and it works around their day to day. And it's like, well, actually, I think that there are quite a few mothers out there who would probably like dependable hours, and so that they can guarantee childcare during those times. And also for students as well. I mean, when I was on a 0 hours contract, I remember you didn't know what you were going to get on the rota from week to week. And sometimes that could come during your lectures. But because you needed the employment, you would miss a lecture.
And also more and more students like having to rely on having consistent wages to afford their way through university as well. Having a 0 hours contract and maybe not getting paid that week would make a massive difference.
It's just an extra layer of security, isn't it? Because if you sign a contract that says, look, you're going to be part-time work, you've got 16 guaranteed hours every week, which is probably about the amount that students want to be on, then you know that if you say no to one shift, they can't just go, right, well, that's fine, we'll rota you off. They're also going to end unfair dismissal. So this actually, I think, is the most interesting one. So at the moment, you've got this sort of precarious probation period. It's sort of like semi-probation. You'll come off of that original time scale, which is basically a time for the employer to see if you work or fit within the company. And then you'll have to wait 2 years until you've actually got proper rights or a proper stronghold in that company. So they're ending that, and it won't be no longer a luxury for the privileged few. Pro that?
I am pro that. I feel because 2 years is quite a long time to have to demonstrate that you are like dedicated to the company that you work for. And the other big policy in there was shutting loopholes that allow fire and rehire. Why don't you tell us about that?
Actually, a joke was made about this by a Tory MP yesterday now that laughed that Sue Gray had been fired and rehired, which not quite the policy. This was a policy actually brought to Parliament first through a private member's bill by Barry Gardiner, who was a backbench Labour MP, still is, and his advisor, Matthew Talbot. And the scheme, the policy that they brought forward was you wouldn't be able to fire an entire cohort of employees and then rehire them, the same employees, on a lesser wage or a weaker contract. And this was sparked in part by the P&O ferries. I think you could call it a scandal, where all of these men who were members of the RMT union were sacked unceremoniously one day, and then P&O brought in replacement workers. Some of those workers are earning under £3 an hour because of the way that they've managed to tally it with, they're not quite under British employment contracts. So it's putting an end to that.
Because I mean that MPO scandal led to the introduction of the statutory code of practice, which also came into effect this year. But that practice just said that fire and hire should be a last resort. It wasn't a ban, and it didn't make an employer liable to any proceedings. Mm-hmm. So it wasn't really worth it.
I mean, it's just so when that private members bill came before Parliament, it just missed out, but that's because Labour were in opposition. But there was huge cross-party support. Sorry, I mean people from all sides, a lot of Tory MPs as well, really in favour of it, because it was totally ludicrous that you were able to essentially liquidate the UK's employment rights by hiring from abroad. It was absolutely extraordinary what went on, and it was devastating for the communities, because if you think, I mean, it was I think it was hundreds of people.
800 people.
800 people. Extraordinary.
Something that certain Tory MPs might not be so keen on is Labour making working from home the default where practical. I mean, Jacob Rees-Mogg wouldn't be happy about that.
No, he wouldn't be happy with it at all. Yeah. So changing the law to make flexible working the default for all, unless the employer can show it's not feasible. So I think that would probably apply to if you need to use certain equipment or you need to be present. I mean, you probably can't be a hotel receptionist and work from home.
Probably not.
But which is the sort of two-tier... It's difficult with this because it's sort of like, it kind of is a two-tier economy, isn't it? Because if you're a teacher, a nurse, a bus driver, then you have to go into work. Mm-hmm. And you don't get access to the benefits that working from home offers. Like, for example, childcare. You know, if you've got a young child and you're working from home, perhaps you don't have to pay childcare that day, mm-hmm. Which is, you know, pretty good. But actually, that reminds me, a lot of the pieces of this legislation that they're hoping to bring forward, a lot of it is actually focused around the family and arguably the low birth rate, which we heard a lot about during the Tory administration. We had the sort of Danny Krugers and the Mims Davies popping up to Miriam Cates, all very upset that we weren't having children. Mm. Actually, this legislation makes it easier for you to have children and still work at the same time. Mm. Like there's new protections for pregnant women and new mothers returning to work, including, which I think is so interesting, protection from dismissal while pregnant or on maternity leave, which you kind of already have. However, also within 6 months of returning to work. I think that is fascinating because there are some women who maybe they've developed postnatal, or perhaps they're just not themselves. Mm-hmm. And I think being thrown back into a work environment, perhaps you weren't as brilliant as before you were pregnant. It happens. And you need a little bit of time to get back into your feet. So it's quite, I think that's a really brilliant move. That's actually a very pro-mother move. Exactly.
And I think you can kind of see that throughout. There's a lot of focus on kind of gender equity as well, making companies publish their disparities with gender and also ethnicity. Mm. But I think on the flexible working point, I can totally see the benefits for people with caring responsibilities, or especially people with disabilities as well. Like working from home would make such a massive difference. But I kind of wonder if there is a downside to the increasing, like everything, your whole life taking place just in your home, just in your household, especially for younger people. Like coming to the office, I think as a young person it's not only combating, you know, increasing isolation or loneliness amongst Gen Z and some millennials, but it's also a career progression thing. You come into the office, it's a chance to connect with older co-workers, to learn from managers. And interestingly, if you look at who takes the most advantage of working from home, it's senior managers. It's not Gen Z or young people in the office. And without those kind of senior managers there, I wonder how much opportunity is there for younger people to learn and grow in the workplace. Yeah, absolutely. The isolation point is really interesting, isn't it? Because I think at the moment as well, it's so expensive to rent or buy in cities that people are moving further out. And that's not just young people, that is actually senior managers, because they go, well, I'm at a point in my life where I'd quite like a house and a garden, and I can't buy that in Manchester where my office is, so I'm living further out and commuting in. Because they've moved out there,
they become isolated because it then becomes, the commute is boring. The commute is difficult.
And it's expensive.
Exactly.
But I just wonder and worry, or even just from like personal experience when I've had other jobs, when I've had to work from home more, like sitting by yourself or just with your same two flatmates for 8 hours a day and then being at home with them after it, it is very isolating, and your world becomes really small. So I do like worry about that for young people just entering the workforce.
There's a friend of mine actually who works for a big tech company, and their default is work from home. They don't go into the office very often. I think that even might have been scaled back further because it's savings for them essentially, because they don't have to provide the office space. And watching her actually become more and more isolated and more shy is really interesting, because there's sort of networking events that she used to love going to that she's now reticent to go to, and it's a symptom of being on your own all day.
Definitely. I remember when the Nuffield Trust did back in 2020, when everyone just started working from home, and obviously there were other things affecting mental health at the time, but they surveyed specifically about working from home, and 80% of people that they surveyed said it had a negative impact on their mental health.
Arguments pro and con. Pro and con. Look at Laura fighting against the flexible working policy. They're also going to strengthen statutory sick pay. However, I have been speaking to, I'll come on to what the unions have had to say about this in a moment, but I have been speaking to a couple of pressure groups who've been working on statutory sick pay. They're not convinced with what's going to be laid down in this. But beyond the bill, there's these 28 proposals that will come down in the legislation today. However, there will be more policies that will need to go through consultation. One of those is a right to switch off, which means employees cannot be contacted out of hours except in exceptional circumstances to allow them rest and recuperation. I am... It's really difficult because it depends what sort of job you work in.
It does.
I think, confessional, I think that our job, you are on your phone a lot. And I think that, we wouldn't get contacted by a manager, but I do think that we're probably still speaking to people about the job who don't work for our organisation. But I think that that's a choice.
Definitely. It's one of those things, there's certain careers that you wouldn't pursue, I think, if you wanted a 9-to-5 that was just a 9-to-5. And I think journalism is one of them. I think the right to disconnect or switch off, as they're calling it here, is so interesting, because I remember hearing about this. I think it was Germany introduced it, like back in 2013. France have it as well, and it being illegal for your manager to email you out of hours. I think it's interesting because I think I'm quite guilty of like sending an email like at a bizarre time because I've thought about it, but I never send it with the expectation that they're going to reply out of hours.
But I suppose if for some people receiving that email, they might think, oh God, I've got to get on with that right now.
Definitely.
And I think if it comes from a manager, perhaps it just sort of adds a layer of stress, doesn't it? But then essentially it's the right that if you want to go onto your emails after hours, you can. And if you don't want to, you can delete the app. I think that's the sort of distinction, isn't it? But I'm so guilty of being on my phone, like doing things at ridiculous times, to the point that sometimes I'll schedule the reply. Yeah. I think if you're sending someone a sort of pressing matter, work to do,
a task,
that's it, at a ridiculous time of night, and there would be an expectation that you would come in the morning and have completed that. It's sort of like, I used to always do my emails before I got into work. I would do that on the commute. And I suppose because the way that we work has changed, that now to me seems ridiculous that I would do that. But then I probably would still do it. Isn't that terrible?
I think as well, it feels so much of this legislation is almost responding to COVID and to what happened to working hours there, because I think if we're talking about our world becoming smaller and the lack of work-life balance, when you are working from home, it does become more and more difficult to separate out this is work time and this is rest and relaxation time. So maybe having something like a right to disconnect, which means you can't be contacted in these times, is a way of readdressing that balance.
There's horror stories online, isn't there, as well, about the way that certain managers contact people.
Really?
Asking that. Anyway, I'll have to show you them one time. So another thing, a couple of other things that are going to consultation. Thought this was really interesting. Review into parental leave and carer leave. Thought that is really interesting because, I mean, this is something that Ed Davies talking about all the time, isn't it? Caring. It's very difficult because you essentially, you're not, you can take time off work, you can take it through holiday, but there are very little recourse to other funds unless your employer is generous.
I do think one other thing that will impact quite a lot of people is the removing of the minimum wage band, so that everyone will get paid the same minimum wage, which is £11.44 rather than the current, which for under 18s can be £6.40, so £5 less,
Which is astonishing.
than your co-worker doing the exact same job.
It's crazy. Yeah, I think that's really landmark, isn't it? Pretty huge, that. Did you know as well, ending strike action has saved, it's actually astonishing. The UK lost 4 million days to strikes between October 2022 and June 2024. So for all of that discussion from the Conservatives that strikes were bringing the country to a halt, well. Right, well.
Thank you for joining us at midnight.
At midnight. Bye.